And I find that there's some confusion. There's some states that have this and some other countries, but there's a difference between an estate tax, which most people are familiar with, versus an inheritance tax. Can you
Correct.
shed some light on the difference between those?
Yeah, the simplest way that I find to explain the difference is that the estate tax is really paid by the decedent, it's paid out of the assets that belong to the decedent. An inheritance tax is paid by the recipient. So let's assume that I've got a state where I've got, again, let's call it $2 million. And I've got one kid that lives in the United States, U.S. citizen living in the United States. Well, actually, I guess for today's world, if we're dealing with a state tax, we've got to have more than a $15 million estate if it applies to a U.S. citizen. But let's assume, or to a green card holder. But even though the estate might not be subject to estate tax in the United States because it's well below the $15 million, if you're living in a country that has inheritance taxes, and let's say you're sending $500,000 to that country, that is so. And when it comes into the country, the person who's receiving the money is required to indicate what the source of the money is. So in this case, it's an inheritance from Great Aunt Martha in the United States. That is subject to inheritance tax, even though it's not subject to estate tax in the United States. Where it gets particularly messy, shall we say, is in the larger estates where, for example, there's been estate tax paid in the United States, and then the recipients also have transfer tax. None of the treaties, to the best of my knowledge, have an offset for estate tax to inheritance tax issues. So you could very well end up paying an estate tax in the United States and also have the recipients be required to pay an inheritance tax when they receive that money in the other country. And please don't ask me which countries have inheritance taxes because I don't have it memorized.
But I think the important thing to understand here is that the estate tax is different from an inheritance tax.
That is correct.
The taxpayer is different. And if the U.S. has an estate tax treaty that offers relief with another country, that may not be applicable to the inheritance tax.
It probably will not be
Applied to the inheritance tax.
Thank you. Applied to the inheritance tax.
That's a huge distinction to understand. Yeah. And so I find that, communicating often and early helps to give an understanding that maybe people don't like that situation, but at least they will accept it if they understand early on. And it avoids no one told me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, unfortunately, the person that is told is probably deceased. So the issue is, how do you let the beneficiaries know? And, again, just from a practical standpoint, it could become very unfair. What if you've got two children, one of whom lives in a country that has a transfer tax and one of whom lives in a country that doesn't? Just by virtue of where they live, one may end up receiving a substantially greater or lesser inheritance than the other one.
Yeah, right. No, that makes sense depending upon the rules of that country.